Hey everybody, happy Monday. Thank you for being along here on this third installment of the previous 3 weeks. We're talking about the conversations in Luke chapter 9. They can also be found in Matthew chapter 16. Reaching kind of the end point of this one and why these verses, why this section means so much to me, and I wanted to split it up a little bit, is it's kind of a roadmap for how to become a Christian, even though that's not really what it was used for at the time. You know, you look at the first week, we were talking about Peter's confession that Jesus Christ was the Messiah. Well, that's the first step in Christianity, is acknowledging that Jesus is the Messiah, that he's the one who came and died for our sins, and that everything's about him, and if we accept that sacrifice, we go to heaven when we die, obviously. The second week, we were talking about taking up your cross and following Jesus, and that's a good reflection of what it's like to be a Christian, and how to approach every day as a Christian, and what it actually means when you get down to the rubber hitting the road, and you get down to the nitty-gritty, and what is being a Christian all about? It's about being a reflection of Jesus, so you're taking up your cross and you're following him daily. And what I really like about today, we're getting into the Transfiguration, is it's kind of the why. It's kind of the reward. So you're talking about becoming a Christian and what that means. And obviously when you become a Christian, it's not entirely so you get to go to heaven. But it's more about living for God, and it's more about spreading the gospel, and it's more about giving the good news that you have already received, and it's about sharing that word because God saved you, so now you want to share that with everyone around you, and you want to help bring those people to heaven as well. And I really like the Transfiguration because this is, before you die, this is about as close as 3 guys were able to get to heaven. And I'm going to go ahead and start reading. So we're in Luke chapter 9, verses 28 through 36. It says, about 8 days after this conversation, the conversation being the take up the cross conversation that we talked about last week, he took Peter, John, and James and went up to the mountain to pray. As he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly 2 men were talking with him, Moses and Elijah. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. Peter and those with him were in a deep sleep, and when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the 2 men standing with him. As the 2 men were departing from him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us set up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he was saying. While he was saying this, a cloud appeared above them and overshadowed them. They became afraid as they entered the cloud, and then a voice came from the cloud saying, "This is my son, the chosen one. Listen to him." After the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. They kept silent at that time, and they told no one what they had seen. So you look at that, and it's just powerful stuff. So they go to the mountaintop. They all lay down, they take a nap, and Jesus starts talking to Moses and Elijah. And as he's talking, his appearance changes, and it says his face is sparkling, and he's as of dazzling white. And what's interesting about that to me is when you look at what the Jews were looking for in the Messiah coming, that's pretty much the example of what they would have wanted. They would have wanted this big conquering hero, dazzling white Jesus to come down and to scoop them out of the Romans' hands and to lead them and to lead their nation and to fulfill the law and everything like that. And that's what's really interesting to me is Jesus is revealing himself to his disciples, but he reveals it to them, this is my first point today, after Peter had made that confession. After Peter had already said, "Look, we know you're the Son of God. I know that you're the Son of God. I know that you're the Messiah. I know that you're this big conquering hero. You didn't come in the way everybody was expecting you to, but we know that's who you are." And after they made that confession, a couple days later, it says 8 days later after that conversation, Jesus finally comes down and he's showing them who he is. He's revealing himself in his full glory, you know, and that's really important because when you look at Matthew 16, verse 17, it's talking about the confession that Peter made. And it says, "Flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, Peter, but my Father." What is that he's referring to? It's the idea that Jesus is the Messiah. And flesh and blood didn't reveal that to Peter, but God did through his holy divine word and through his speaking and through Jesus' actions. And now all of a sudden Peter sees Jesus for who he really is, and he's rewarded a couple days later by actually physically getting to see Jesus for who he really is. And just think about how impulsive Peter is as a person. You know, you read about some of the decisions he makes. You read about him denying Christ. You read about him when the people were coming and he whips out a sword and cuts the dude's ear off. You read about all these things that Peter did on a whim and on an impulse. And you think about that being probably the majority of his life. And when Jesus asked, "Who do the people say that I am?" Peter said, "You're the Son of God. You're the Messiah." And again, Peter's a really impulsive guy. So to get some validation on one of those impulsive claims that he made, that had to be fantastic for Peter. So that's what's really great about this, is Jesus gets to show off a little bit. He gets to show himself for who he really is, and he gets to show the disciples, okay, you say that I'm the Messiah. This is what the Messiah looks like. And he shows himself in all that glory. And the second point I take away from this, you look at the two prophets that were there speaking with him, and it was Moses and it was Elijah. And I kind of got to thinking about this at one point. Why are those two guys important? Why are those the two guys that are talking to Jesus? And the first one, you look at Elijah. Elijah was a very revered prophet. He did a ton for the Israelites. He spoke a lot. As far as what he was saying and things like that, the volume of how much God used him. God used Elijah for a lot. One of my favorite stories is Elijah going against the prophets of Baal, taking that stand against 450 prophets of Baal. Elijah also never died. God took him directly up to heaven, so I think that might be, another reason why Elijah was used in this context. And not to be this way, and not to kind of belittle anything else, but Elijah was a rock star. As far as prophets were concerned, people looked at Elijah and they were like, whoa, that's a dude right there. That's a prophet. That's my hero. That's who I want to be. Like, kids had posters of Elijah, on their walls that he had signed, things like that. So it makes sense for him to be there. And, you look at some of the prophecies that he did as far as, Jesus was concerned, and some of the people even thought that Jesus was Elijah reincarnate. So that's why it's important that Elijah's down talking to Jesus, because their message was the same and the way that they were used was similar. Obviously, Jesus to a greater extent, but Elijah was a big-time prophet. And so the one that kind of was a little weird to me was Moses. And I was like, well, I know who Elijah is. I know that he put this out, and more people from a secular point of view know who Moses is. But I was kind of curious why he picked Moses. And doing a little research and reading a little bit, Moses was the mouthpiece for God as far as like giving the law to the Israelites was concerned. Moses would go to the mountaintop, he'd write it on the tablets, and he'd go down and he'd share it with the Israelites. And it's funny that he's one of the ones talking to Jesus, because Moses was the mouthpiece for God and the one who wrote down the law and gave it to the Israelites from God directly. And you have him face to face with Jesus, who is the fulfillment of the law, who is the law taken and perfected. And he is the entire reason that we don't live under the same law that they lived under before, and things like that. And you have Moses coming face to face with Jesus, and it's kind of this passing of the torch, so to speak. Moses had written the law and the Israelites had lived under it for so long, and all of a sudden he's face to face with Jesus, and Jesus gets to talk with Moses. And it's basically, like I said, a passing of the torch, and gets to go into the next phase of what the Bible, what Christianity, what God himself has to offer to us. And all of a sudden, the fulfillment of the law falls upon Jesus' shoulders. And when he died for our sins, he died so that we didn't have to make sacrifices to live under the law any longer. He gave us laws to follow, and he gave us rules to follow and commandments to obey. But at this point, it was so much less on us that we had to do. You look back at what the Israelites actually had to do with giving up, the 10% and the sacrifices and go to the temple all the time and things like that. And you know, I'm kind of glazing over some of the bigger ones because I don't really want to get into a huge discussion about the law. But Jesus was that fulfillment, and Moses was basically there, you know, guiding it along the way. So Moses got to be present for the next phase of the law, for the next phase of what was happening in Christianity, and he got to see it with his own eyes, and that's just really cool to me. And the third point I take away is, you know, Peter's talking, and he says, God, it's good to be here. Some translations say it's good to stay here. We need to stay here. We need to build shelters. We need to build some tents. And you stay in this one, and Moses and Elijah, and I don't know where he was planning on staying, but he was talking about 3 shelters. So, you know, it's this idea that Peter was talking about how good it is to stay there. And it just gets me thinking, you know, I like to preach on this a lot after a big Disciple Now weekend, or after a big church camp, or after a big, you know, event happens in the church. And the reason is, you know, it's good to experience spiritual highs, for lack of a better term. It's good to be on that mountaintop. But that's not where most of the work is done. Most of the work is done Monday through Saturday, your daily life and things like that. And it may be good to be there occasionally, but it's not good to stay there. Because what good is it if you're in a spiritual high all the time, surrounded by like-minded people that agree with you, and you're super spiritual all the time, and you never have any testing of your faith, you never have any pushback, and quite frankly, you never have anybody to share your faith with. You're getting away from the nitty-gritty of what Christianity is all about, and going out and spreading the gospel and sharing in the Great Commission and everything like that. So it's good to be there every now and then. It's good to be on the mountaintop, but you don't want to stay on the mountaintop. Not permanently, at least, because when's the work going to get done? When are you going to bring in new people to the faith? When are you going to have time to just get by yourself and be with God, you know, at these big grand gestures and big grand camps and big grand mountaintops? You don't have that time where you're just getting alone with God and you're growing spiritually. And I think that's one thing that we kind of, you know, get away from, is we think it's good to be up here all the time. And that's great, but there's times where you got to be down. There's times where you got to be in the middle. There's you know, Christianity, like anything else, is going to have its ups and downs. And if you're in a constant state of up, you're not doing any good for the kingdom and in the long haul, because you're not reaching other people with this message. So yeah, it'd be great to go hang out on the mountaintop with Jesus for a while. But eventually you got to get back down in the dirt, and you got to get back down, and you got to start digging, and you got to start growing, and you got to start reaching. So that's my big challenge today, guys, is if you are up here, if you know, had a great worship service yesterday, that's great. I'm not diminishing that at all, but make sure that you don't fall completely off when you're on the bottom. You know, I mean, because God is just as much here for you when you're here than he is when you're here. And he's just as real when you're down in that valley than he is when you're up on that mountain. And the great thing about God is that he doesn't change. He doesn't fluctuate. His opinion of you, his value, his looking upon you when you become his child, it doesn't change based on what state of mind you're in, or based on, you know, where you are in your life, or based on if you're in a high or a low. It doesn't matter. You are his child, and he died for you just as much on your best day as he did for your worst day. And that goes for all humans as well. He died for the worst of us as much as he did for the best of us. So when you're thinking that it's good to be here all the time, and it's good to be spiritually elevated all the time, then when is the spreading of the gospel going to happen? So that's one thing I want to challenge you with this week is to get out and to spread the gospel a little bit, and don't be distracted by the spiritual highs and the spiritual lows. Just get out and just share a little bit and see what happens. You know, because the funny thing, when you start to be more forward with your faith, you start to meet people who are more forward with their faith. And you get to start formulating ideas, and you get to start growing the kingdom in ways that you didn't think was possible. You know, just for instance, I've started these videos, you know, and I've got some people that want to help me, you know, start recording these videos and edit them and put them together, and, you know, kind of take it to a new level as far as production standpoint goes. You know, it's not just one guy with a phone having to write the scripture backwards, you know, anymore so it shows up correct on the phone. And it's just funny because if you have a vision that's given to you by God and you're forward with that and you share that, there are people that are going to want to help you along the way. But if you're so caught up in your own experience and your own interpretation of the gospel and your own spiritual highs, you might miss people that want to help you out along the way, or people that you can help out. So that's my challenge this week is just reach out, share the gospel with some like-minded people, maybe even with some people that aren't as like-minded as you, and see how God blesses you this week. Because if you're forward with your faith, God will bless you. I can attest to that just putting these videos together. So happy Monday, guys. I will get something special put together next week. I'm not quite there yet. If anyone has any suggestions or anything they'd like me to talk about, put it in the comments, and we'll see where we go. Thanks.